Hello and welcome then to this week's episode. We are in episode 4 as we're looking at behaviour in schools and how to support staff with dealing with students. In this week's episode, we're going to be looking at scripted conversations and how they can help support students in lessons, but also scripted conversations around staff and parents as well. So let's get into it. So today we're looking at scripted conversations, and we're looking in particular how they can be useful for dealing with parents, students, and also staff, particularly if they get into issues. So what is a scripted conversation? Well, it is literally just that. It's about basically having a designed script in place so that when you have to deal with an issue, you already have a plan as to how it's going to go. Now, they're not always going to work. Sometimes you may come across situations that you can't prepare for, or they go in a different direction, or even the person who you're dealing with won't actually respond to it. But I like to think of it as a bit like revision cards. You've got a box, and in that box you're going to pull out like kind of the script that you're going to use. You have to be flexible with it. Like I said, it's not always going to work. So we've got our timer up, and we're going to keep an eye on that timer as we go. But basically I'm just going to talk you through a few of these kind of ideas, and hopefully it'll be useful for you to take away and start to create your own kind of scripted conversation. So the script is, as we say, it's like having that pre-prepared idea of what you're going to do. Why do we have it? Well, in simple terms, you're taking away the emotion from the situation. Whenever we deal with behaviour normally, particularly with students, there is always an emotional element attached to it. It's very easy to get drawn into that and get drawn into that kind of like tit for tat type thing when a student starts arguing and you'll go, well, no, I'm going to do this. And they go, well, I'm going to do that. And before you know it, you're into almost like a playground mentality. So by having something scripted, you can detach away and you can focus around what it is you want the conversation to be about. And more often than not, it's about bringing it back to education, because we all know that if you actually focus on the education, you're taken away from the personal aspect. And when we're dealing with behaviour, what's really kind of important is that we tackle it from a point of view of looking at the facts rather than the emotional element, because the student will have an emotion around it, the parent will have an emotion around it. That's what we're going to do. So there's those 3 types. We've got looking at the scripted conversation with parents, with staff, and with students. Now, from a parent's point of view, it might be in meetings, phone calls home, when a parent meets you on the gate or comes into reception. You've got to have that preparation for how you're going to deal with that. Now, we're not going to focus too much on that today. It will come in another video. But that is about reducing that conflict, actively listening as well, and having the kind of comments ready to say to diffuse situations. More often than not, if you're dealing with conflict with a parent, it's about listening, taking on board what they've got to say, listen to what they've got to say, and then you can then deal with the situation after. If you go into it straight away just having that confrontation with them, it's only going to go one way. So with students, so I'll jump ahead to staff really first. With staff, it's about being able to challenge them on the behaviours that they might be exhibiting around the school or how they're dealing with things, and having kind of like a set framework for what you want to go through. So when you want to deal with them around something, how you can be sensitive for what their issues are, their own emotions. More often than not, when it comes to behaviour, there are emotions attached around it. When people mishandle behaviour or are struggling with it, there is normally an emotion attached around it, and that's something we've got to tackle and be quite open and honest about. So that's one of the type. But what we're going to focus on is students, and a particular reason. So you can, in the classroom, out of the classroom, dealing with individuals, whole groups. So why do we have scripted conversations? Well, it helps with routine. We'll talk about the routines in another session. It's about being really clear about expectations. I talked last week and I said about having those kind of, the biggest compliment you can have as a teacher is when students kind of repeat things to you when I talk about structure and routine. And so if you're using scripted conversations, as soon as you start down that line of, for example, we talk about not being ready, respectful, safe. If you say, okay, we're not quite being ready yet, you're already starting to telegraph where the conversation's going, and the students know if you're consistent. And again, consistency is that key word, comes up all the time about staff being consistent and students knowing where they sit on certain issues. Then you're going to find it a lot easier, because students will automatically know what's going to happen. They can see what's coming. So clear expectations. It forewarns them of the next steps. We talked about the consistency. It's a way of being assertive but calm, because if you know that something's going to happen, you don't need to be emotional about it. For example, if a student follows a certain path and they're failing to meet expectations and you're going down your behaviour policy route, ultimately, why do you need to get worried or upset? If you know a student's going to get a detention or a sanction for what they've done, you don't need to fall out about it. It's matter of fact, it's inevitable. It's something that's going to happen. Where sometimes we go wrong is that people get emotionally involved and they want an instant response. And we'll talk a little bit later on about what's important when it comes to behaviour. Some people focus too much on the sanction, saying, I want a detention. I want to be able to punish the child because they're not doing as at all. And there are 3 parts, if you look at the DfE guidance on behaviour, when it comes to deterrent, actual just pure punitive punishment, and then rehabilitation. So ultimately, those are the 3 parts of sanctions. But when it comes to actually dealing with students' behaviour, we're not focusing on sanctions, we're focusing on outcome. And we'll talk about that later, because it's what do you actually want from the situation? Are you just looking to have an argument and fall out with someone to prove your point because you want to feel better? That's an emotional response. Or are you looking to say, actually, I want to have this outcome? And if you want to have an outcome, i.e. you want them to do as they're told, then it doesn't need emotion. It's just matter of fact, because if they don't do it, then there is a sanction. If they do that and they've complied with you, that's what we want. So having those scripted conversations means that you're gearing up towards what you want as an outcome. So it has to be outcome based, and that's what we're going to focus on. So one of the things that I like to talk about when we deal with any behaviour is the quote from James Baldwin, which says, children have never been very good at listening to their elders, but they have never failed to imitate them. So when I talk about behaviour and training staff, I talk about modelling the behaviour we expect from students, i.e. if we're going to ask them to do something, we should be exhibiting that first. So don't turn around to them and have a go at them if they're late. If you're always late to lessons, you've got to model that behaviour. Don't scream and shout at them and then tell them not to be rude to you if you're already doing those things. You've got to model the behaviour. So reflection is really, really important. And I learned in my early years of my career from another teacher who's fantastic in terms of watching them, and that's the advice I'd give you, is listen and learn from other people, about being a reflective practitioner. Everything you do, you've got to reflect on it. So when you're talking about behaviour, if something goes wrong in the lesson, don't ask what the student did wrong. Think about, is there some other way you could have dealt with it? You could have done everything right and it still go wrong, but then you're thinking, what else could I do that still would be right but is different? And it's not blaming the teacher, it's about being reflective and thinking, how can we, because we're the ones who have to change. If you read through the Paul Dick's book, you'll see that he talks about this idea that we've got to change before the students will, because otherwise, where does it begin? So coming back to behaviour with students, there's kind of 2 parts I want you to think about when we build up to these scripted conversations. Is when a student misbehaves, it's normally down to 2 reasons, and those 2 reasons are to either get something or to avoid something. So what are they after, or what are they trying to avoid? So in the lesson, if you're doing work when you're saying to them to read things out and they don't want to do it, it's because they're trying to avoid it. If they're literally sort of saying, I want this, I want that, I want to sit over there with my friend, why is it? Because they want to be able to chat, they want to be able to talk. So it comes down to 2 things that they're always after. They're either trying to avoid something or they're trying to get something. So if you know which one it is that they're trying to do, that's part of the conversation. Then you can start to think about your kind of scripts and how you're going to do that. So the first thing, and I will get into some of those scripts and some of the conversations towards the end of the video, and I'll give you some examples. But the first thing is your conversation script should be based on education. So one of the things that I use all the time is if a student's not working in the lesson and I'm talking to the parent or I'm talking to the student, I will use their book as an example, because you're detaching away from the emotion. You're not saying you're refusing to do as you're told and we're having a fallout. What you're doing is you're looking at the book saying, look, this is what I expect. You are better than this. And again, I'm now starting to dip into some of those scripted conversations and those key things that we talk about. It's like, you're better than this. You want to build that child up to be able to get them to be where they need to be. And they are capable. All students are capable. We've got to get the best out of them. That's our job. So you're looking to provide yourself with confidence by having that script, because if you know it works and you've used it before, you know how it's hopefully going to go. Not always all the time, so don't rely on it, but it is there as a backup. Also, you're looking to build the child's confidence around what they can do. So again, thinking about how we're talking to them positively. You're basing the conversation around your policies and procedures. So if you say you're not quite ready yet, I need you to do this. This is the expectation. You're using that language positively around what they're doing, not just telling them off. Also, when you're looking at those things in terms of the conversations with the classroom, if you're looking at groups, never single someone out. You talk to them in private or quietly, low level. But certainly if you're talking to a group, to say, I'll do a countdown. So I'll put our hands up for silence. I might count down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. At the end of it, if I've not got everyone there, I'm going, right, I'm at 20%, I'm at 30%, 40%, 50%, 60%. So I've got those kind of scripts, and they are part of the scripts. They're whole class scripts around saying, this is my expectation. So, and normally, if you look for a response, the amazing thing is you put your hand up, don't always get the response. But as soon as you start saying, I've got 10%, 20%, 30%, 50%, 100%, and it doesn't have to be accurate, you're not counting them, you're just gauging the general response of the room, you will see that students will quickly put their hand up because they'll see it as a competitive nature. So having that script ready to go gets all the students involved. So that's one way of doing it. Again, it's positive because you're not singling out students, you're trying to get the collective responsibility of the whole group. So you're linking it all to rules. As I said before, using their book as evidence. Those are some of the key things. So when you're dealing with the students, and I'll give you an example of one I had this week where I had a student who came to the lesson, sat where he shouldn't have been according to seating plan, a link to what we talked about last week. And so initially what I said was, let's just bring up seating plan on the board, let's just check where everyone needs to be. So we're looking at seating plan, and I've identified that the student's not in the right place, and said, well, okay, before I identify and go over to that individual student to say, can we all just check where we are, where we need to be, because it's about maximising learning today. I expect you all to be where you're supposed to be. And you park it for a second, give them opportunity, give them a little bit of time. Then what I do is go over and talk to that student individually, separately once everyone else is on their task, their starter, do now task, bell task, whatever it is you want to call it. Go over and just say, oh, I've noticed you're not quite in the right seat today. Can you make sure you just move over to there for me? And the way in which you frame it is just say, tell them explicitly, just I want you to go and sit over there. You're not asking them, you're telling them it's an expectation. I need you to go and sit over there because that's where you expect to sit. Please do that now. Thank you. Right, move on. And again, some people talk about that idea of like, should we say please and thank you for things? And I know there's a whole kind of debate on whether we should be saying, please do that. I think it's just politeness. I'm not actually asking them. It's just the way in which I frame it so that it's positive. But there is an expectation, and how you deliver that is really, really important. So that's what I'd say in the first instance. If they then refuse, then what I can do is I can go over to them and or just literally think about how I'm going to frame it. I'm going to say, okay, in my mind, I'm already picturing it. They're trying to avoid something because they're certainly not trying to get something unless they're trying to sit with their friend at the back because they want to have those conversations. So I'm going to go and say to them, look, I need you to go and sit there because I need you focused, I need you to listen to me. I want to help you today. I need you to do that now, so then it's not going to be any more disruption to the lesson. You have that conversation with them. Give them opportunities to do that again. Take up time. If they don't do it, then you can go back to them. Now, this is where you've got to think about, are you looking to win the battle or win the war? Ultimately in the lesson, and it depends on your school policy and procedures, different schools will do different things. Some schools may say, no, we don't accept that, remove them, etc., etc. And if that's the policy, that's fine, because the students will know that. If your school has a bit more of an approach of trying to work with students, give them opportunities, and particularly if they're not disturbing the learning of others, I mean, it depends again, because if they're sat in a position where they're going to talk, you're obviously going to have them moved. But if they are refusing to and they're still working, say, right, I can see that you're working here today. I've asked you to move, you're refusing to move, so what I'm going to have to do is I'll make a phone call, and I will be issuing a sanction in the lesson, but I'd rather you move so we can avoid that. If you can do that, that'd be fantastic. Thank you. If they don't, then you can follow that up. And again, as long as they're not disturbing the learning of others. If, however, they are disturbing the learning of others, then you may have a remove policy, and you can go through and follow that. Having that scripted conversation. What's really important is that by the end of the lesson, you do follow that up, because that's where you make or break your systems. Sometimes I think staff are so busy that they forget to follow things up, or they think, oh, it's not really that important, I'll leave it till next time. That's the biggest failure that people have, is because they don't follow it up and not consistent, and students will know it. If the student knows you will phone home, and they are in their mind they're thinking, I know he'll do it, and you've got that reputation and you will follow things up professionally and in the right way, then what you'll find is that students will respond and do the right thing. So having those scripted conversations around those things is really important, because then you can start to gear up towards them realising what's going to happen. Talk to the student after the lesson, ask them to stay behind. Again, talking to them in private rather than public. So you're going to say to them, this is my expectation, this is what I want you to do, let's look at your work today. Right, so you've done some really good work today, if they've done that. If they haven't, you say, we haven't met the expectations today, this is why I want you to move. If, however, they have done everything right and they weren't talking, you can still say, but that's my expectation. It's your room at the end of the day, it's your expectations. They will sit where they're supposed to. So that's how we begin to start scripting those conversations. The other thing is starting to plan, and we talk about these planning for poor behaviour. It's not because we want to then just jump straight into sanctions. Remember, we want outcome. So I'll use other examples, like when a student turns around and if they're, say, for example, wearing trainers rather than shoes, and you might have that conversation with them, say, I need you to put on your shoes, please. And they turn around and say, well, no one else asks me. Okay, that's fine. Nobody else is asking you, but I'm asking you because that's part of our school rules. Or the classic one when you go to say to them, say, well, I've worn these for 6 months and no one else has said to me. And I'll say things like, and again, you got to gauge this. I'll turn around and say, well, if that's 6 months that you've not had, that's a lot of detentions you need to have served, but we're not going to issue those because that wouldn't be fair. But what I do need you to do is to do what I've asked you to do now. And again, it's about that framing things in the right way, not being sarcastic, not being rude, but having that conversation. And you've got to base it on the relationship that you have with the student. Sometimes those things won't be right to say because it'll just antagonize them even more. So scripting the conversation, planning ahead, thinking about what you're going to say is important to getting the outcome that you want. So I want you to think about, what is it that I need to do in order to make sure that I've prepared for those situations. I've got that script ready. Listen to other people. It's incredibly important to listen to other people, because they will be the ones that you can look at how they deal with stuff. You can say, yes, I agree with that. No, I don't agree with that. I've heard people have conversations before. It works for them, but I don't necessarily agree with the style or the comments that they said. It's very personal. Behavior is very, very personal to you and your own thing. You can't pretend to be somebody else. You can't pretend to nick somebody else's phrases, somebody else's kind of language. Doesn't always work. You have to find your own way. You've got to try things out. You've got to kind of reflect on them, and that reflective process is so important to taking your teaching to the next step, next level. So think about the issues that you're having. Think about the language that you might use to be able to tackle those things. And coming back to like the conversation with parents and things, starting conversations positively is incredibly important when you're dealing with something negative. So whether it's the student, parent, or teacher, think about how you open that conversation. Sometimes relating something, say, "Oh, how you been? Is everything okay? You know, are you okay to talk right now?" That's important to the building up of those conversations to get the outcome that you want. So a couple of examples there for you. The key thing really is relating to that student, building relationships and framing things in a positive way, but also being very clear about expectations. We've hit our time limit, so hopefully that's really useful. It's only a very short kind of explanation. If there's any other information you want or any other things that you'd like to know or ideas, please put them in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one. Thanks very much.